Welcome to the Worldbuilding Workshop, the companion podcast to the book of the same name. My name is Stephen Sloda, and I am here with my trusted co-author,
Trent
and in this inaugural episode, we're going to discuss the book's prologue. Specifically, why did we write this book? What's the relationship between this book and the broader field of playful learning? And what are our reflections on the playful learning community in general, including the Games Learning and Society conference that we both used to attend, and that I think was fair to say the crucible in which our friendship and research partnership was forged. We're not going to rehash our personal history since that's all in the book, but we wanted to touch on the connections between our academic and personal interests, as well as how our research has evolved from game-based learning to collaborative world building and its utility for teaching empathy and critical thinking. That said, Trent, why don't you tell us a little bit about your scholarship and how it led to our co-authorship of this book?
Yeah, sure. So my research really was in using tabletop role-playing games to teach creative writing. First time that I used a tabletop role-playing game, we used the Vampire the Masquerade system and created a post-apocalyptic version of Milwaukee. This was in 2011. I was in graduate school at University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee. And from there, it worked out really, really well. It was sort of like still to this day, probably the best class that I've had. They just really bought in at a very deep level. During that class, first of all, I thought, there's a lot of work that could be done in this area. And that's kind of where my career has taken me, is just sort of like following along. What can we do with different types of tabletop role-playing games or storytelling games in creative writing classrooms? But I was also really interested in the world building aspect. That I just said, we're going to have this post-apocalyptic version of Milwaukee. It's, however many years in the future, 50, 100 years in the future. We didn't talk about it a whole lot more than that. And what I really became interested in during this semester were all the assumptions that students were making about how this world worked. And I noticed that nobody's assumptions were quite the same. So that was one of the things that really, at the root, started me thinking about, wait a minute, how do we, when we create a world in language or try and represent a world in language, what are some of the assumptions that we're making? And then when you put that into a collaborative framework, you kind of have to negotiate how the world works for everybody, right? So I started thinking, and this is even before I just started getting into games and learning and just kind of thinking about, wait a minute, we all put our heads together and we all have sort of a general idea of how the world works. But then, you start thinking about, my subject position is different and things like that. And if you're working on a story that's set in a fictional world with multiple authors, you need to have everybody on the same page as to how the world sort of works. So it turns out to be a really good method for people to talk about how they think the world works, whether it's a real world or a fictional world, science fiction or fantasy or whatever. Just that sort of stepping back and forth, you need to be able to ground observations in how you think our world works in order to communicate that to somebody else about how a fictional world works. All of that stuff together, it's basically using maps, using digital tools like wikis, collaborative writing, and then bringing in gameful aspects are really everything that I've been doing since I started at RIT in 2013. So I've been there now for, it's going to be 12 years, I think. And that's really just iterations of doing different things that would include, either doing a little bit of world building and then doing some tabletop role-playing game in the world that they built, or using a pre-existing world like Star Wars or Game of Thrones, where students can leverage their knowledge of that world when they come in. Lots of different methods, lots of different things that I've tried. But between that, and then on sort of the literature and media side, looking at these expansive transmedia story worlds, like the Star Wars Galaxy is the one that I've taught a class on, but I'm also interested in The Witcher, also interested in these sort of other games that span, or other works that span comics and novels and short stories. And that's what I do sort of on the lit and media side. And then the creative writing side, it's lots of world building and then lots of sort of tabletop role-playing games, digital tools, interactive fiction, all those kind of things.
It's interesting that you mentioned that. I'd forgotten that you started working at RIT that long ago, which I think just makes me feel old. But I think that was around the time, not long after we had met, right? We met in 2011, I think. And then you had been, I remember you were kind of in and out of the conference at one point because one of your children was born.
That's correct.
That was an interesting time. I kind of fell into this from a different pathway. I didn't start in a creative field, or at least not one that I think could be characterized as the humanities. I talked a little bit about this in the prologue, but I was in the hard sciences doing molecular biology and genetic engineering. And what got me interested in all of this, apart from the fact that I was sort of personally interested in games and their potential application in education, is that I gravitated toward education. I knew I wanted to be a teacher. And in the classroom, I started to experiment with a lot of this stuff, which is pretty common, I think, based on our experiences with the Games Learning and Society Conference and the broader community around playful learning generally. There's just a lot of people who got into the field because they themselves were gamers and said, hey, I want to try doing something that reflects the thing that I'm interested in outside of school. And maybe this is going to be a way to engage my students, or maybe this is going to be more quote unquote fun, or maybe this is going to give us some new opportunity to do inquiry-based learning. So I didn't explicitly start as an educator or a researcher knowing that this was where I was going to end up, but gradually developed this sort of incremental process by which I moved more and more and more into the realm of interactive storytelling and narrative development for education. And that sort of manifested during grad school for me, where I looked into instructional design as a career pathway, knowing that I wanted to be in academia, but I wanted to build stuff. And I guess it's just sort of a pleasant coincidence that we both ended up being interested in world building because of the fact that it was inquiry based and it was constructivist and it had all these other attributes that made it feel like a productive activity in addition to being something that you'd study and write about and talk to other people about. So my pathway there was a little bit messier, I think, but I do find that it helps talking to other educators who've gone on that journey themselves and then use that as a vehicle to be able to write more, talk more, present more on this specific topic of world building. And I guess that actually becomes a nice natural segue to the question of how did this book even come together? Like, what was the point of writing it? What did we get out of it? What did we want the audience to get out of it? And we didn't talk about this in the book, really. I mean, we talk about why we think world building is a useful tool and why we want teachers to adopt it generally in the epilogue, but I don't think we ever articulated why this project was a thing. So let's talk a little bit about that. Sure. What was your impetus for starting this project or getting in contact with MIT Press? And how did you end up onboarding me as part of that?
Yeah, so this is, it's interesting too, because as you were talking, I was thinking, I took a graduate seminar in James Joyce, and I remember trying to figure out what was going to be something that I could write about James Joyce for my exam or my term papers or whatever, because it seemed like absolutely everything had already been written about it. Like I've got to find this tiny little thing that no one had ever talked about, and there's whole they've been studying him for a century or whatever. And I think one of the things that I was really attracted to by both creative writing studies and games and learning is that it was still relatively new. I mean, when we, I think GLS was in its 6th year or something like that when we met in 2011. I think that's right, 6th or 7th year.
And it was 7.
It was still, basically whatever you were trying to do at that time, it was still pretty novel, pretty new. And I think that's one of the things too that's so funny. I think I mentioned this to you, Steve, outside of the podcast, but like it seems really new to people that we introduced this to, and I'm like, oh, I've been doing this kind of thing for 15 years, right? You know what I mean? It's not new to me. It's new to you. And that's where, too, I think that this idea that it's a pretty tried and true method from this point, and I think that's all part of it. But I wrote Collaborative World Building for Writers and Gamers. It was published by Bloomsbury Academic in 2018. That was the result of me doing lots of different world building classes from 2011 up until the point that I published that book. And I had to cut a lot out of it. And I also wanted to make it very accessible, had almost no learning theory in it because there just wasn't room. It's more of a guide of how a group of people or a class could collaboratively build something, whether it's a tabletop role-playing game or some other kind of creative work. But actually, it was during COVID that I received an email from MIT Press saying, would you be interested? There's a point in the book in which I say, hey, look, you could do this for historical worlds. You could do this for contemporary sort of social issues or things like that. And the email from MIT Press basically said, hey, why don't you write for us a book that is about world building for not creative writing, for real world sort of application or other kinds of disciplinary application. I said, great, because this was like in April or so, I think March, April of 2020 when we were all under a COVID lockdown. And I was
great timing. Yeah, exactly. What else could you be doing besides sitting down and writing a book, right?
Exactly. And at that time too, I thought, oh, well, this whole pandemic is going to blow over by midsummer, right? And we'll get back to life as usual. And as we all know, it didn't really work out like that. But I signed the contract in May. And then as I started to work on it, and I still had, and this is, true for a year after, right? Or even probably till today, that COVID brain fog where I just couldn't get myself interested or excited or organized. And I started thinking, okay, well, what am I going to start doing? I want to start off by introducing some of the learning sciences stuff. and I know enough to be dangerous, right? Like that's where it's like I can sort of hack around this stuff and I kind of understand the principles of constructionism and constructivism and all those things, but it's certainly not my natural sort of territory, which is sort of the creative writing and game study side. So when I started feeling like I could not, like I was in wet cement and couldn't really start to move, I thought, hey, you know what I should do is, find an expert who does this stuff, like my good friend Steve, who this is like, that's his natural world. So instead of me writing all of this stuff and pretending I knew what I was talking about, having to ask for lots and lots of help, why don't we just co-author it? And as I sort of mentioned when we were going through our final edits, that's like probably the best decision that I made throughout the entire thing, because again, this idea of collaboration, you get different viewpoints, and it's been super helpful to get your viewpoint, not only as somebody who is ed psych expert, right, knows all the learning theory, but just sort of different attitudes and different takes on the way that world building can be applied in the classroom and things like that. So this is very long, and I'll let you sort of speak to that too. I don't remember how long into the process it was when I dropped you a line and said, would you be interested in co-authoring this? But, the point was to be able to take the methodology that I'd sort of outlined in the collaborative world building book and say, okay, well, how could this be useful to a historian or a social scientist or even someone teaching in, the natural sciences or something like that? And that was really sort of the impetus, is to say, hey, look, this is a really powerful anti-disciplinary approach that anybody can sort of bring in with a little bit of thought, sort of case study approach or something like that. Just start off with a little world building exercise, right? And start thinking about how all the different people in the room or different people involved in the project would articulate how they think this world in the moment works. And I'm sure we'll talk about this more in other chapters. But basically, the idea of a world is that it's a specific place in time that you're trying to articulate what are the social forces at play, who exists in that world, how do those social forces push on people in different ways just based on who they are, their belief systems, but then also just race, class, gender, religion, sexuality, all those kind of things. The world may have social forces that we could more or less agree on, but even so, they affect us differently. And then we think about the world, think about solutions, think about problem solving in different ways based on where we find ourselves within that space. So the idea would be then to be able to take the concepts from world building and then be able to apply them to texts, to works of literature, works of art, but also case studies, things across a variety of different disciplines, to be able to sort of build that common ground, not to assume that everybody is coming at this from the same viewpoint, but actually we're way better off coming at every question from lots and lots of different viewpoints. So then I'll ask you, you were kind enough to accept the invitation and took a lot of the stress off of me. But what was it that you were attracted to, and like what is it that you thought, oh, I can really bring something unique and new to the book?
Yeah, well, first of all, the thing I immediately thought of as you were describing what happened when you were experiencing this sense of being stuck in wet cement, that it was Homer Simpson becoming the garbage commissioner and saying, can't someone else do it? Which is partly the function of not knowing enough about a thing to be able to say what you don't know, right? Like that you're not confident in the sense that you can say, actually, that's somebody else's domain. If you know just enough about the thing that you worry you're going to say something wrong, that's a persistent academic fear of mine. Like whenever I write about anything, I'm always worried how far outside the bounds of my specific niche I'm getting.
Exactly.
And
yeah.
Which we've talked about before in other contexts where the average person probably doesn't have a good enough calibration to understand when they're outside the bounds of what they know or don't know, and that we often all overassume what we know or what other people know. So anyway, I appreciated the fact that as time went on, and I remember when you started this project, because of the fact that you started pinging me in Slack to ask questions about, hey, what's the difference between constructivism and constructionism? And then you'd give some definition of those things that was correct. But it was very evident, I think, that you felt uncomfortable speaking as an expert about that stuff. Likewise, I came into this wanting to be a participant in it because I've said this to a number of people now. This book has become a project that was written for me several years ago, right? Like this idea that I was teaching an instructional media and game design course in addition to an interactive storytelling course. The former was for graduate students who are in K-12 as in-service teachers. They were actually practicing educators who were learning about instructional media as part of this one-year accelerated ed tech program that I co-administrated. And then I had this other group of students who were interactive storytellers in the game design digital media program. 2020 was the year where I had done world building a number of times in those classes previously. It was the first time I synthesized those two classes so that even though the students were acting asynchronously and didn't even know one another's names, the worlds they were creating were interacting with each other. And it just so happened that COVID was a useful fulcrum to get them to think about complex systems because the supply chains were all broken and people couldn't get toilet paper. And it's nothing that we hadn't talked about previously. And I think I've told you the story before where the first day of my game design or systems design courses, I would always come in and bring a Starbucks cup with me. And we'll talk more about this when we talk about chapter 1 of the book. But I used to give that long spiel about complex systems and how we don't think enough about them. And one of my students at the time said, "Whoa, you didn't just drop a truth bomb, you dropped a truth nuke." And I was like, well, okay, so this is obviously resonating in some way with some of these people. And I need them to understand in their own respective domain, whether you're building a game or you are a programmer or an artist or you're an in-service educator, that this process of understanding the world is useful to you and that there is a reason to do it apart from passing this class or apart from trying to deconstruct Star Wars, which are both good things, I think, but that this became more of a cognitive framework from my perspective. And so when I was teaching that instructional media course, this is the book I wanted as a textbook for that class. And I cribbed quite a bit of what I was doing from you, including, I think, the surveys that you gave and the entire framework for how the categories and the subcategories are delineated. But the element of the project that I thought I could contribute to would be, okay, what is the substantive justification for why this works, right? And I didn't want it to be like so much of the playful learning literature where it's either a one-off thing that nobody can replicate because of the fact that it was just this very esoteric context or environment, or you can't get that group of students back together again, or that instructor was doing something that nobody else could possibly do. But I also didn't want us to end up in the edutainment category where there was no point in replicating the thing because it wasn't doing the job it needed to do anyway. And we opened the prologue with that commentary about chocolate covered broccoli and it being a not useful model anymore. And I think at one time it did make some sense as a shorthand for what we were trying to accomplish. But once that language got co-opted into the realm of edutainment, or maybe it was always a part of that realm, edutainment as a whole became this antagonist to what we were actually trying to accomplish, which was a manifest change in the way education is done in line with the works of philosophers and theorists going back before John Dewey, right? This is not, and I think that's probably a good thing to stipulate for people. The ideas we synthesize in this book are not necessarily unique or new. I don't think we invented the idea of using world building in case studies in the context of a classroom. I know for a fact we didn't do that, but to do it in this way with this specific template based on models we built from our experience in playful learning and game-based learning, I think is different. And I think it ends up being this cataloging of both our professional arcs as well as our friendship over the last 14-ish years. I think that ends up being really valuable for you and I personally and professionally, but also to leave behind some artifact or set of templates that other educators can draw on, because we don't want people reinventing the wheel or getting stuck in the cul-de-sac of, wow, games seem like they were a lot of fun in the classroom, let's do something with them. There's a meta-analysis, I actually talk about it in a couple different places in the book, but the Review of Educational Research meta-analysis I co-authored with Mike Young and a number of other people, that was the first wholesale evaluation of games in education. That ended up being sort of the etude to the opus that is this book, where we opened or closed that paper, I should say. We opened the conversation and closed that paper by saying, we need to start understanding all of this is being situated and that you cannot create one game that's going to work the same way for all students in all circumstances, that it has to have the flexibility to be deployed in a number of different ways for different localities and different groups of people, and it needs to be particularized. And as a result, we should not collectively as a field keep asking the question, are games quote unquote good or bad for education? Because it's a stupid question. There is no such thing as games as a whole being good or bad. It's, is this particular game good in this particular context for these particular learners? And I think looking back on GLS and when we met, that was the thing that made me attracted to your work, was that for the most part, there were a lot of people who were doing the chocolate covered broccoli thing. And I used insert game here with my students and that taught them this, or this is why it all blew up when I tried to do it, which those, and we mentioned this in the prologue as well, that those tracks had developed quite a long time into GLS. Like it took a while to get to the point where there were clearly this track of people who had been doing this and familiar with it and had an idea of what worked and didn't work versus the people who were new to it and trying things for the first time. And I think there was necessarily a set of presentations for both of those groups, but they stopped talking to each other.
Yeah.
And I think what was really shocking is that a number of the people from the group of novices, they just didn't ever transition into the group of experts. And we can have a whole separate conversation about that. But I think that this book ended up being an effort to bring together those conversations and make it possible for the people who were in the novice track to make that jump to the more expert track, right? And so the book as a whole ends up being written non-academically. It's not a research study. Like this book is not supposed to be
not a monograph,
dissertation. It's not a monograph. It's designed to talk to that audience. And that audience is very broad and I think deep, where it can include traditional educators like K-12 and college professors and corporate training. I think it can also incorporate people who are just generally interested in the field of world building or the field of playful learning or gaming or just how do you be a good educator, right? Like there's a lot of those bases covered here. And I don't know, I'm talking for a little while, but to hand it back to you, I mean, is that kind of your understanding of the value of this kind of book?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was taking notes while you were talking because you hit so many of the things that have resonated with me over the past several years of trying to bring in workshops and do things along these lines to sort of formalize this process of world building. One of which is, you'd said, and I think this is something still before the book is out, I'm still sort of nervous about, is I am not a historian. I am not a history of science. I am not, a sociologist or things like that. And it can be kind of maybe arrogant to think, oh, well, I know a process that anybody could use, right? And it's really like, hey, look, what we want to try and do is give you a framework that is outside of a discipline. And then you, as the practitioner, as the expert, can then apply that in any way that you feel fit, right? Like if only 20% of it works for you, that's fine, right? Like it may not work for a sociology class of a certain nature or a 300 level versus a 500 level, right? That's going to be completely up to the readers of the book, right? So I think that's one of the things that, again, the idea being is that it is not within any one discipline. It's not within any discipline. He said a framework, sort of a methodology, a way to think, like a cognitive model that should work. And this is where I remember I presented to our college of liberal arts, and one of the historians said, oh, well, you're taking the world in a moment in time and figuring out what social pressures are there. Like, that's what we already do. Kind of chuckled, like you're just doing what a historian does. But the thing that's funny is now I've heard that from a variety of different people. And it's like, well, hey, look, if we're all doing the same thing, then why do we even have disciplines? So
it's funny. Well, I was waiting for you to come back to that because you had used the phrase anti-disciplinary. And I actually think we haven't talked about that specific word before, but that is a really good articulation of what this is. It is, and I've talked about it as being disciplinarily flexible or that it's interdisciplinary. And the job that I used to have as an academic was an interdisciplinary job. And it was, and that kind of speaks to what you're getting at, which is we have all of these silos set up and don't talk to each other, at least not in any real meaningful way. And I think that's most evident when you go to conferences and you see how isolated everybody is within their own university ecosystem. And it is a little bit different now that everything can be done digitally and remotely. We're recording this remotely. We have friends and colleagues that we talk to remotely. Our foreword was written by Brian Alexander, who we work with remotely. Like all of these things are possible, but for a long time, and I would argue even still, universities have not created environments where those kinds of conversations can easily happen. And for the most part, we're so inundated as individuals with our jobs, right? Our actual responsibilities like grading and service and all this other stuff, that we just don't have time to sit down and talk to the historians or talk to the sociologists or talk to the social workers or whomever, name your discipline. And as a result, we end up replicating a lot of the same processes across those disciplines, but then don't have a common language to talk about it.
Right, exactly.
And I think to your point, like somebody doesn't need to do 100% of this for it to work. And perhaps the best, I know I said this wasn't based on experimentation and it wasn't explicitly about research, but the best opportunity for us to try this and see what was working and what wasn't was during COVID, because really everybody just wanted a thing to do that would maybe help in this really chaotic, difficult situation. I know for myself, I was really fortunate that my colleague Mike Young and I were both already teaching online for years before COVID. So we knew how to do distance learning. Like that was an area of interest and research for both of us for a decade before COVID happened. And I think more in Mike's case, which isn't necessarily a slight at him. So, Mike, if you're listening to this, I'm not calling you old, but the goal of COVID became how do we minimize damage
Yeah.
and also take advantage of the fact that this is a new paradigm and maybe we can try something else that we hadn't been doing consistently before. So, I had this interdisciplinary group of people who wanted to do that. And I think a lot of those people are reflected in the case studies we collected for the book, that
Yeah.
we made friends and colleagues and found other people who were trying stuff and seeing what stuck to the wall. And world building as a larger entity was something we could tinker with in that environment to say, okay, what if we did apply this in a chemistry classroom? What if we did apply this in a lecture of 200 people? What if we did this with just a handful of students who are doing some, very close reading of a specific book, right? And
Right.
all of those different opportunities sort of came together to fill out the template that we now have and that we're trying to get out into the hands of other people so that hopefully,
Yeah. And I think
they'll distribute it.
one of the things too that I think about both just with our sort of dynamic and interactions, and I think overall, even at GLS, it had that sort of vibe, and I think a lot of interdisciplinary spaces have this, that for so long in academia, things have been so lean that it's almost like everyone is competing with each other. Like my discipline is better than yours, right? And it's like, okay, well, if you step back a little bit, we don't live our lives and experience them through the lens of disciplines, right? Like we experience our daily life. And then disciplines have been a way in which we say, okay, well, we can look at this section of our lives and analyze it using this methodology. But it feels like we've gotten so far along that it's like, I can't think about the world in any other way other than my discipline, right? The nice part when we were at GLS is, you sit down for lunch or, at game time at night, and you're talking to somebody who's a political scientist and a physicist and whoever. And it is totally pointless to try and like one up each other, right? Like it's like,
Yeah.
we're sitting around, we're playing a fun game, we're drinking beer, and we're going to go to like a one-upmanship where like, MLA, which is the big English conference, 10,000, 15,000 people or whatever go to it. I've only been a few times, and every time it feels like a competition. Like you can't even have a normal conversation with somebody in a bar without feeling like you've got to drop a name or I read this or I didn't read that. And I think one of the things is, well, of course I'm not up to speed on political science. That's not my field, right? So it's like, feel free to tell me, like, where am I at? What, like, what's interesting to you? Or what would a political scientist say as we're playing Fiasco or some other game, right? So it really kind of drops sort of that sense of you're always defending, right? You're always defending your dissertation or defending this argument, or you're getting hostile questions from the audience or things like that. Really, I feel like GLS was very absent of that kind of atmosphere. And I think, too, other things that have changed as the field has sort of matured, and I think you said in the book, gone to seed, which is sort of a term that I like. In that process, I think I was really thinking about how do you bring games specifically into classrooms with their rules and all those kinds of things, which I found can be daunting to people who aren't big players of games, where I think more recently the shift is towards more gameful and playful, where it doesn't need to be like necessarily such a hard and fast rule, right? That this is a game that you're going to be playing, and more like, well, hey, this process by which we're doing world building and things like that. When I was first working on this, it's borrowing heavily from tabletop role playing games, but it's not a game, right? And there's lots of great world building games like Microscope I love, or A Quiet Year is a kind of world building game, and those have very specific uses, like you said. But the world building book that we're encouraging people to try is more gameful and more playful than it is you start, you follow this rule, you go here, and it progresses. And I think just like anything, conscientious educators who know how to take a tool and apply it, or know how to take a methodology and apply it to their class, you don't need to be a gamer to get any of this world building stuff. You don't need to be a fiction writer. You don't need to be doing any of this stuff. You just kind of got to be willing to go with the flow. Another thing that I'd sort of jotted down is I think both of us in 2013, 2015, 2016 were big into like trying to proselytize. Like this is going to be like games in education is going to be the thing. You got to bring games in. And now it's like, hey, look, if you want to learn how to do this because you're having a difficult time engaging with this generation of students, this might be something that you'd be interested in, right? So it's more like an invitation. If you're looking for something for an educator who is willing to come on board to do the genuine decentered, you're going to be off to the side. The students are going to be working a lot. There's, a little bit of lecturing involved usually, but for the most part, it's just kind of listening to conversations and interjecting. You got to be the kind of person who wants to do that or is comfortable doing that. If you're not, then this system probably isn't going to work. If you really want to feel like you need to control everything in your class, this is probably not, for educators at least, this is probably not a great approach. But the good news is you're probably not even listening to this podcast if this is the case, right? Because it just is too foreign and sort of too weird. But one of the things that I would also sort of add in here is I've got two sons that are now turning 13, one just turned 16, that games and gaming are a kind of literacy for them that I understand very well. But lots of people in my sort of age demographic, especially, I'm 50, 51, people who are, a little bit older, I think don't have that same kind of sense of games as being part of their daily life, daily experience, the same way that it is for Gen X people. And I feel like even if there's plenty of people too who didn't grow up playing games or whatever. And that is also something where it's like, why do these students understand or get so drawn in to these, sort of gameful, playful approaches? And it's because it's not at all weird for them. It feels very natural for them, whereas it feels unnatural for some of the instructors. And I think that this is something that can be really turned into a benefit, that if you want to be the professor or the instructor in a decentered classroom, being able to give some of that agency, a lot of the agency, over to the students to say, hey, look, I'm going to be the one who's going to try and keep us on task, make sure that we don't get too far afield, that we're always going to be hitting the learning outcomes. But more or less, you're going to be doing all of the work of like generating the content and steering towards your interests and all those kind of things. For me as an educator, I can't imagine doing 15 weeks of slides, going in, lecturing for 75 minutes twice a week for 15 weeks. That sounds terrible to me. And I much more like going in with this idea of, hey, look, whatever you are all interested in, it changes every semester, it changes between classes. We're going to take whatever you're interested in and we're going to stick it in the mixer, right? And then it's going to be very sort of lumpy and uneven, and some people may be really interested in this topic or that topic. And as long as everybody, and that's kind of what I think the world building methodology is sort of about, you can't do it partially, right? Like you got to be all in. You got to be all in from the get-go and build it from the ground up. And then as you're building it out, if you get interested in, maybe you're interested in finance or economics or women's rights or something like that, you can follow those paths once the base is built into literally any direction, because those things exist. Those kinds of interests, economic concerns, issues of equality and inequality, they exist in absolutely every discipline, right? I mean, like those things exist, and they should be things that we're talking about. And again, if you're teaching physics or you're teaching chemistry, and you're not sure how simulation or role play or world building would fit in, well, if you just think about, okay, well, wait a minute, we know that scientists are diverse people, and they're going to be coming at these questions from diverse backgrounds. So it can even be used in those places, I think, to be able to get people on board working together with the same project. And it really has, over the years, it really creates a wonderful network of relationships between these students as well, many of whom keep in touch well after the class is over, because they become good friends and because I think they've learned from each other, which is very different than, when I was an undergrad at UW-Madison with 10,000 students in our incoming class, right? You don't meet anybody in a 300-person lecture, right? Like you just sit there, you read the student newspaper, you do the crossword, you know what I mean? Maybe you meet people in your discussion sections. But this is a really different way of being like, hey, look, we're not going to learn anything until we start talking to each other. Still keeping on task, and it's not all fun and games, right? But it can be lower stress, and whatever you have that you can bring to the table, whatever your interests are, those are welcome. And you may find that other people are interested in those things as well.
That last point is really important, that it hands the agency back to the learners. So it's not about the instructor's interests per se. It's about what are the learners hoping to get out of this process for themselves. And if they want a career, I don't know if this was, I assume this is probably true of most of your students too. It certainly was of mine. I didn't know necessarily what career pathways they were interested in, because I would have people from all kinds of different disciplinary backgrounds showing up in my interactive storytelling class. But the goal was for them ultimately to be able to walk out explaining to me, what am I going to do with this? And if they were going to go into finance, or they were going to go into chemistry, or they were going to go into social work, they had their own interpretation of how this framework fit in that trajectory for them. And we talk a little bit about this in the chapter about assessment, so we'll come back to it later. But during my mid and end semester one-on-one conferences with them, I would always ask, what do you see yourself doing with this information going forward? How are these skills going to help you in XYZ domain? And that was something they couldn't fake. So if they weren't doing the readings, they weren't participating in the process, they tried to use an AI LLM. It wouldn't work because they needed to be able to connect the dots for themselves, and nobody could do that for them. I mean, I had experiences where when I was an undergrad, people tried to pay me to write a term paper for them. Like that would not work in this situation because nobody's going to be able to speak to your life world or your life in the way that you can. And
Right.
that's one of the things I really enjoy about this. Now, you had, toward the beginning of what you were saying, you had pointed out this tension, I think, between us talking all about gamification or at least game-based learning, and then you don't need to know anything about games for this to be successful. That's one of the things that I've been trying to emphasize to people as we migrate toward the release of this book, like that much like Andor as a television show is built on the Star Wars framework, you don't need Star Wars knowledge for Andor to be meaningful because it's really not about Star Wars. It's about the rise of authoritarianism. It's about how rebellions happen. It's about all the work that goes into preparing a group of people to do hard things.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that what we've written is of the quality of Andor, just to be clear. Although I would like to do an episode of this where we use the world building system to evaluate Andor. I think that'd be pretty cool. So maybe, put a pin in that. We might come back to it. But the broader idea being that this world building framework is meant to be something apart from game-based learning and playful learning. It can certainly be playful. It can certainly be gameful, but it only has to be those things as much as it makes sense for the environment where you're applying it. So I know that we talk a little bit about this in the book, but generally my students know that I hate the term gamification and the implications that it has. I almost entirely associate it with operant conditioning and behavioral reinforcement that, you need to make X number of widgets. So we're going to give you points or experience or whatever until you make those widgets. And if you do it, you get a coupon to not do homework or whatever. Like it's a very unfriendly system to somebody who cares about deeper learning and transfer.
Right.
So we're going to set aside the gamification element of this, but there was a chapter of the book we cut, and we actually had talked about whether we should do an episode of the podcast about that chapter, which I think we should. It's going to be sort of the lost topic, but the idea was that we need a system that's going to differentiate these various kinds of approaches to instruction in the playful learning field that talk about gamification or gamefulness, playfulness, and fun as an emotional experience as distinct and discrete things that define the parameters of the actual tool you're using. And at the end of that cut chapter, I had talked a little bit about why this makes sense to talk about in the realm of world building. And it's because world building can be agnostic on all of those spectra, depending on what it is you're trying to achieve and who you're working with. So for example, if you were doing a world building project that concerned maternal mortality. I mean, if you want to talk about serious games, I'd say that's a pretty serious topic, right? Yeah. Or if you're talking about racism, if you're talking about the 2020 George Floyd protests, all of those different movements, civil rights movements, etc., those are all serious. They're serious in the sense that we want them to be taken seriously. We want people to understand the value of those kinds of movements and how they can be, what lessons can be applied in the future. That doesn't mean that it's a game in the sense that there have to be points and scores and winners and losers, and you have to have fun doing it, and it has to be silly. We actually talk about this later on in the book as well, the idea that students should be taught, or at least primed, to think of this as being something to take seriously without it necessarily being serious. And I think we could interrogate what those terms actually mean, but for all intents and purposes, when we're talking about our own world building projects, we're essentially saying that it is serious only insofar as we want the students to behave like researchers within that specific domain they're studying. And that if you were going to go and use this for the American Revolution, that your students are interrogating the American Revolution in a way that a historian would, or that if you're using this for a biology classroom, that the students are interrogating the topics the way a biologist would. And what I think is undergirding all of this is a concept that I've written about in parallel with Roger Travis and Kevin Balestrini and some of the other folks we know. And actually, this is going back to you and I meeting. This is one of the things I saw in your work that made me really interested in it, was the idea that it comported with this one-to-one ratio between the game objective and the learning objective. A lot of this gamification stuff, a lot of the playful learning stuff, it's predicated on you being able to learn something in the game and break through whatever narrative or chocolate-covered slop is on top of it to be able to figure out what is the underlying learning objective and how am I actually going to transfer that. But as we talk about in chapter 3, and again, we'll come back to this, transfer is very, very hard to cause, and it is very difficult to measure. And it is only made harder when you put more layers of abstraction on the thing you're trying to get transferred. And so Roger, Kevin, myself, Mark Pearsall, some of the other folks that I had worked with on Operation Lapis, which is a year-long or 2-year-long Latin-based role-playing game, the most important principle that came out of that entire project was this idea of a one-to-one ratio between game and learning objective. That if you want your game or your playful instantiation of whatever to work, quote unquote, in some transferable sense, it needs to make sure that there is no barrier to transfer between the thing the student is doing and the thing you want them to actually do in the real world. So I use this example a lot when I used to present at GLS, but Math Blaster is the perfect exemplar for what not to do, because it abstracts the idea of doing arithmetic through the blowing up asteroids with the laser gun. And what you're really learning isn't how to use arithmetic in a context where it actually matters. You're learning how to play the game. And I actually really loved the phrase you had written in the prologue about James Paul Gee's 2003, What Video Games Can Teach Us About Learning and Literacy, the idea that it was a book that launched 1,000 researchers. Like, that is a pretty accurate characterization, and I still recommend it to people. People who haven't gotten into games and education, or that they're kind of approaching this the first time. I still think it's one of the best books about this topic, because it's not really how do you choose this specific game and make it function in this specific learning environment. It is a broader digestion of what makes games compelling. And in the context for that book, for those of you who don't know, James Paul Gee was watching his own son play games and realized that he was learning stuff from Pajama Sam. And that obviously games had to be compelling in some way that wasn't just a Skinner box, right? That you're putting in the inputs and you're getting the rewards at the end of it. There had to be something else going on that is actually teaching you about the game itself. And to do that as a game designer, when you're trying to not only get somebody to pay money to do this learning, but you have to do it without being there over their shoulder to tell them what to do. That idea is extremely powerful and relevant in the domain of transfer. How are you going to teach somebody to do a thing that you aren't there to monitor? And we can talk more about the intentional spring model when we get to the chapter of this podcast about theory, but how are you going to get somebody that you are interacting with indirectly to understand a concept and transfer it into other areas of this game or outside the game in some way, depending on what it is? So for example, Papers, Please, really good game. It teaches you about something that's important outside of the game world, and it does it in a way that there is no one sitting over your shoulder telling you exactly what you need to do next. And that, I think, is at the core of what we wanted to accomplish with this. So insofar as there's a tension between what we're saying about gamification, playful learning, etc., and world building, and how those two things can be treated as exclusive, where you don't need knowledge of game-based learning or playful learning to do world building successfully, that's the reason why. Is because world building is supported by the same one-to-one ratio infrastructure that successful playful learning and game-based education is. So we're not really talking about games for learning or play for learning or world building even. This is the theory-driven element of this, the idea that this constructivist, inquiry-driven stuff actually works, and we have a rationale for why that works that has actually been empirically evaluated. So it's not just the edutainment schlock. Like, there is real time and attention paid to what we're trying to accomplish here. And we promise you, to those of you listening who may be skeptical, we hope you'll stick with us, because the reality is you can then take those bones and do your own thing with them just as much as you can with world building, right? If you wanted to create some new inquiry-based anchored instruction system, there's no reason you couldn't do that. And so the book is actually there to support you in that endeavor as much as it is to support you in world building.
Yeah. I was going to say, too, it's got a little bit more in common, I think, with digital games than tabletop games, because some tabletop games, especially Twilight Imperium and whatever, you need a master's degree to even understand the rules for some of those. But for the digital games, I mean, back in the day, you would get a booklet, a 30-page booklet that would walk you through how to play the game, right? And it's funny because, you really wouldn't ever read that. You wouldn't sit down and read that before you would start playing the game. You might reference it to figure it out. And now there's mini tutorials in games if they need to show you how mechanics work, right? Sort of whatever. But the whole idea is, you now download a game and you just start playing it, right? And like through playing it, you learn what to do, what not to do, right? You're rewarded or punished based on the decisions that you're doing. And I think that, and it may even be in Gee's book, I haven't read it for so long, but that idea of having a manual that you would read before you start playing a digital video game, it's like the textbook, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
nobody wants the decontextualized explanation. You want to do the thing, right? And it's like, okay, so
Mm-hmm.
there are, and I think one of the things too, we don't really talk about it that much in the book, but I think it's important, is that it also privileges people who they learn better doing that. You know what I mean? Like they're able to
Mm-hmm.
take a decontextualized text and apply it. So when we're doing grading, how much are we just rewarding people who are able to do that better rather than mastering the
Yeah.
content? They're just being able to sort of like be able to take the decontextualized thing to the new model. But one of the conversations that I'd had with a professor at RIT who teaches hazmat disaster recovery is one of the things they struggle with are all these soft skills, right? Where it's like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
well, this is the order that you would need to do, and you're going to need to be working with federal and state agencies. They really have a hard time. Like, well, what if the sheriff is a jerk? Right? You know what I mean? Or what if somebody's really, if you're a woman and someone's really sexist or something like that, right? And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
those are the situations in which people find themselves all the time, right? Like if you
Yeah.
are being rushed out and you're going to an area that you've never been to in the country or potentially the world, you are suddenly now in a completely new world in which you're trying to figure out, okay, not everybody here is playing the same, is on the same level, thinking about
Right.
things the same way, having the same priorities. And world building doesn't solve any of that, right? It doesn't make you more equipped, but at least it dials in to, hey, look, when you arrive in a new place, or if you're traveling, or if you're even going to just, a conference or something like that, just take a second and think about, okay, well, what is the environment that I'm walking into here, right? Is it formal? Is it informal? Are there going to be experts or newbies? Is it going to be welcoming? Is it going to, have me out as arm's length? And just being able to sort of mentally prepare yourself to cycle through lots of different perspectives that you may encounter, I think
Mm-hmm.
is like way better than going to a Saturday, look people in the eye or validate what they're saying, right? And that's where, you do the world building and then you say, okay, well, let's do a role play in which you think about what would all the different perspectives be. And then a simulation, right, is putting that into action. What if something else happens? What if, situation changes? How would
Mm-hmm.
all of these different people adapt in their minds and in their attitudes and all these other kind of things because the world is always shifting and it's always changing. And I think so much of the pedagogy and so much of the education that we receive, the default assumption is that the world is a certain way and it works a certain way and you just need to learn it, right? It's that
Mm-hmm.
didactic kind of banking model, the free air banking model of education, in which these disciplines are what you need to learn, right? But then the reality is, well, you're going to be in a workplace. Even if you're an engineer, you're going to be working with clients and customers and, coworkers. And, someone gets hit by a bus and Sheila goes into labor early and, all these other kind of things happen. And like, that's the reality, is that's the way that the world, I use this maybe in scare quotes. That's the way the world actually works, is all of this stuff is moving all of the time. So much of it is completely unpredictable, but that's part of what you're trying through education. I mean, this is like you'd said before, like what's the goal of education or higher education? Well, yeah, sure, to learn these disciplines, but it's really, I think, to be flexible in your thinking. And like, one of the things that you've always said, you want your students to leave your class asking better questions than the ones that they came in, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
your discipline is sort of the curtains or the drapes or whatever, right? But the real central thing is, how do you attend to a person who is going to find themselves consistently moving through different worlds, even every day, and through different roles? I'm a parent and a child, right? I've
Mm-hmm.
got parents and I've got kids. I'm that sandwich generation, right? Which is, it's different. My teenagers don't look at the world as the same way, but maybe they will, in 20, 30 years, if they find themselves in the same situation, maybe then they can say like, oh, that's what it's like. You know what I mean? To
Mm-hmm.
have parent trying to deal with parents' medical issues while going to your kid's band concert, right? That can be sort of a stressful thing, but you don't really appreciate it until you're in that situation. So again, that's one of those things where, I take this approach as an educator as well. Always attend to the human beings in the room first, right? And like you had said,
Mm-hmm.
what you're going to take away from this is going to be largely what you put into it. The more you put into it, the more you're going to be able to take out of it. And some of them want to just sort of do the minimum and get out with the minimum. And there's always going to be students who do that. But one of the things that I found too, and it goes back to this question of play versus work and engagement and fun and all those kind of things, that there have been plenty of people, especially some of the old school sort of naysayers for this stuff. Well, of course they're having fun. Of course your classes are popular. They're playing games. And it's like, okay, see, but what you're missing here, very conveniently glossing over, is it's not that it's fun, it's that it's engaging, right? And they're
Mm-hmm.
learning and they are feeling validated. Like they're feeling like their life's experiences are being validated and they're hearing other people's experiences, right? And it's like, well,
Mm-hmm.
that's really exciting. That's something that it's like, oh, wow, this isn't some esoteric topic that I will never need to use again in my life. Well, this is life. This is, it's just one of those ways of being like, okay, well, when I go from class to class to class, I'm me and the subjects change, but we're still talking about the same world for the most part, right? Just sort of different
Hmm.
aspects of it. And I think, I mean, one of the things that I always go on and on about in higher ed, and it probably works the same through K through 12 too, is that I think we as educators make a huge assumption about students being able to connect the dots. So they go to
Yeah.
a sociology class, and then they go to a chemistry lab, and then they have to take a fitness class, and then they, do it. And like, we're just like, oh, well, they understand all of these things. And it's like, we're talking about, for traditional age college students, 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, they're anxious and stressed out about their futures, about their social relationships, about all these other things. I really don't think that they're trying to piece together how their chemistry lab, exists in the same world as their sociology class or whatever it is. Even though it may be clear for us or more clear for us, I think the more that we can do to make those connections and offer those connections to students to
Hmm.
be able to say critical thinking, empathy, these things that are super important, those are part of you as a person. And it doesn't matter whether you're going to Disney World or you're going to a conference, right? Like, you're still that person, and you're going to be encountering different types of people, different kinds of scenarios, different kinds of interactions. And that ability to understand what's appropriate and inappropriate, at various times and various places, when to put on your disciplinary hat, when to take it off, like all those kinds of questions. I think that's the kind of thing that, and going back to something I said too, where there was so much tension and sort of competition. One of, I guess, the benefits of COVID sort of breaking the spine of higher ed is, especially for those of us in the humanities, it's like the stakes are now so much lower. It feels, it's like,
Yeah.
it could either be apocalyptic, in which they close your department, but like, really, there's no reason why history and philosophy and English need to be quibbling over, who has the best or who is the most insightful on the human condition. It's like, okay, we all are working with scraps here. So let's really just kind of think about maybe getting back to that human question of what can we do for these students that is going to support them? How can we work together? How can we see things that cross over, concepts that cross over? And again, that idea being that at the end of the day, if you're student focused, if you're thinking about how all of this stuff matters, not necessarily for you landing grants and making, tons of money on, your research or things like that, but really just thinking pedagogically, how can I create a space in which students can do the work that is validating, that is exciting. And if they just do it, they can't help but learn. It's totally different than cramming for an exam, taking the test, and then forgetting all of that stuff, which
Hmm.
I am not good at that. I've got an older brother who is excellent at that kind of like short-term memory kind of retrieval. But, I've said too that there are, having gone to undergrad now, whatever, in the late 90s, I can hardly remember a specific thing from any of those classes because they were predominantly lecture, right? Like, I got a great
Hmm.
education, but it's the stuff that I remember the most are individual experiences of when I synthesized a bunch of ideas and then like a light bulb went on, right? And I think that that's where what we're trying to do, and I think what the world building methodology promises to do, is to allow learners to have that light bulb come on more consistently and have being able to find those connections between things that may seem disparate, just by sort of like showing the sort of skeletal nature of like, this is the way our institutions work, this is the way
Hmm.
that the way our world, so to speak, works. And I mean, this is where too, like, the world of the Henrietta campus where RIT is located is very different than the world of downtown Rochester, right? Which has got a whole bunch of different urban issues and problems and things like that. We're out in the suburbs. Or you could go out to a rural community, right? And again, find something else where it's like, okay, again, totally different rules that are sort of at play, all within 15-20 minute drive from wherever we may be at any given moment.
Yeah, I think actually that's a great way to kind of wrap things up. I keep thinking about the fact that you brought up empathy and critical thinking, and we haven't even talked about that yet, is why that's part of the subtitle for the book, that it can teach critical thinking and empathy. That, I think, is the piece that transcends all of the different disciplinary considerations here. If you're a good critical thinker in one domain, you can probably be a pretty good critical thinker in a different domain. And the thing that you're bringing from one domain to the other is an ability to perceive and act on the affordances of these different elements of a specific discipline. And
Right.
that's what we don't teach. Like, to go back to what you were saying about the way that an 18-year-old or 19-year-old views their experience in school, they aren't connecting the dots because we haven't actually made a good effort to show them how to connect the dots. And it took me until I was in undergrad to really start internalizing the fact that what I was reading in my American history pre 1865 course was all happening at the same time as the stuff I was learning about in my microbiology course, right?
Right.
All of these discoveries were happening concurrently. And I think one of the most interesting elements of learning history that way, or at least the thing that made it interesting and engaging to me, was thinking about, hey, these people actually lived at the same time and some of them corresponded with one another. And, I was never really in at least not grade school thinking about, well, what were scientists saying to these political figures, or what were these economists saying to these social figures, social cultural figures, right?
Right.
And having that barrier broken down and deconstructed made the world seem a lot more cognizable, that I was able to make more sense of what it was to be human and
Yep.
in what ways humanity has changed and in what ways it has stayed the same, and really starting to empathize, I think, with more of the world than I had previously been able to. And I could go down a whole separate rabbit hole about my personal understanding of religion or culture or popularity or whatever.
Yep.
But the piece that really matters is that I finally came to understand that core issue. The person who lived in 10th century Central America was not really that different than me, at least on a universal scale and a universal timeline. But at the same time, my sociocultural context and the social forces that are influencing my behavior are inherently different than theirs. And those things are connected temporally, right? Like the things that happen in the 10th century resonate now. And we can, I think, later talk about what it really means for history to quote unquote repeat itself, and how world building helps you break that notion that history is cyclical, or that any given outcome is predetermined, that there are nuances to the way that different aspects of the world influence one another. But the broad concept of world building is just a useful mechanism to have these conversations with people who've never thought about the world this way before.
Right.
And I think that's the dual spear of empathy and critical thinking, that we are helping these students understand and apply these skills in a particular way, but toward the end of understanding other people and the human condition and striving towards some sense of capital T truth about what the world is. And I think when we get to the end of the next episode, when we talk about empathy and critical thinking and how we define those things, it might be a little bit clearer, but suffice to say that that's sort of going to persist through everything we write in the book. This idea that it's not about a discipline, it's not about a specific time or place. It is about how do you take from the experience of co-constructing a world something that you can then hopefully critically think about and then use to empathize with other people to, in your case of, hazardous waste removal or hazardous environmental catastrophe resolution, the idea that you can understand why that sheriff is being a jerk, and how maybe you can come to an understanding where you have an opportunity to shift the perspective of that person. And that shifting won't look the same for every other person. It's going to be dependent on the context that they're a part of. That is a thing that is just very hard to teach through didactic lecture, because it has to be experienced. And so that said, let's go through our outro here just to elaborate a little bit on what's going to come next. The next chapter we're going to focus on will be chapter 1 of the book. That will talk about the complex systems mentality we've brought to this. Are there any things you want to flag from chapter 1 that you think will be really interesting or relevant to people?
I think just the idea that, the examples that we're using are not from any one discipline. It's just sort of, it's the cup of coffee question, right? Like, you can do this to, we've all got our devices, and, I think we even mentioned this in this chapter. I think one of the things to take away would be that the world is so bewilderingly complex that we can really only come to terms with little bits. You have to carve off a little bit to examine it, because otherwise, like we're talking about, well, where did my plastic cup come from, right? It's like, okay, well, there, even just this simple thing, or this book, or whatever else I've got on my tabletop, just the number of human beings and processes and things that bring all of these things into life, we don't think about it, because to think about it would be paralyzing, right? So you just kind of have to, I think your brain just says, okay, well, we're going to gloss over this, right? You're not going to worry about where this cup from. It's for sale at Target, and you bought it, and now you have it, right? You know what I mean? It's like, you're not thinking about how does my credit card chip work with the reader to take money out of my, you know what I mean? Like you could think about that at any given moment, about any aspect of this, right? And this is, I think, where it comes back to the disciplinarity of it, where, the world building and thinking through these processes and things like that, it's really just trying to sort of like dial in the perspective of, oh, I could do this at any point, at any time, for anything, and start to gain a better understanding of it, right? And that's sort of like the cool part about it. And I find myself doing it myself all the time, right? Like, you're traveling or whatever it is, and you just think, oh, well, that's funny. That person, is doing this thing because that's, they eat fish on Friday or whatever, you know what I mean? Because of their religious beliefs or whatever it is. And I think it's a way to make, at least for me, and hopefully this is the experience for other people as well, it's a way to make all of that bewildering complexity feel a little bit more home with it, right? Where it's like, at least if you can understand, even if you don't know all of the details, it's not coming out of left field. It's not paranormal, right? It's not any of these things that can't be explained. It's stuff that you can sort of, like the idea of, world building. You have these experiences. You think the world works in a certain way. You have some sort of experience that either adds to it, or you need to refine what you were thinking, or you meet someone who changes your idea of what a certain demographic is like, or whatever. It's that classic, you never stop learning, right? Like, you're always making adjustments to what you understand about the world, how the people work in it, maybe even members of your own family or whatever it is. Just to me, at least, it's a way of being able to say, like, okay, take a deep breath. The world is super complex, and we know that, and people are super complex. But this is one way, at least, you can start to apply a model to get at least some comfort from saying, okay, it all kind of makes sense. It's not always, it may not always be reassuring or comforting, but at least the idea that it is not completely inscrutable. The world is knowable.
Yeah.
Even if you need to change the model of what you thought multiple times over the course of your life as you change, that's just part of it, right? That is part of being a critically thinking, empathetic human being who I think is more at home rather than, falling victim to demagogues and get-rich-quick schemes and all these other kind of things that other bad actors in the world are trying to, convince people, you need my help, you need this, you need that. I think this is where, for me at least, thinking through and having this kind of model in your mind as you go about your life, not to be too grandiose, but I think it helps. I mean, I think it helps being able to say, like, okay, well, why would somebody act like this? Where is this coming from? Those kinds of questions.
Yeah, I find it to be both extremely liberating and comforting, in addition to horrifying simultaneously.
Yeah, exactly.
It's equal parts, and I have found that it's worth it. Like, that's really what it comes down to, is worth it. I think it matters more for my students in the end than anything else I could be doing, because if they take nothing else from the class, at least the thing they're getting is a tool to deconstruct reality for themselves and hopefully build up some of the cognitive immunity, if for lack of a better phrase, to prevent being misinformed, or to prevent being demagogued, or to prevent all of these other terrible things that can happen because of the fallibility of the human brain. And I think there's this nice synthesis of psychology, education, technology, philosophy, playfulness, all the things I really care about. And I just find that being able to share that with other people and immunize them from demagoguery is, in and of itself, a pretty satisfying thing to do. So
yeah. And I think, longer term too, depending on the success of the book and whether we get good audience, like, just keeping these conversations going, I'm always super interested in what people are doing, like with the collaborative world building book. I'll get some people who will write and say, oh, I did this in my classroom, or I did that, and it's fantastic. It's like, okay, great. I'm glad that this was useful for you, and I want to hear, right? You know what I mean? Or did you do something that didn't work? And hopefully that's the kind of conversation too, that if we can get some traction with this, then we can start to have a conversation with non-academics and academics about these kinds of topics, and how world building is something that maybe, they're starting to do, or they're taking it different directions than we had thought of. So yeah.
We should solicit listener feedback at some point to be able to get some of these questions, and then maybe we'll do a Q&A mailbag. That said, thank you all for tuning in for this first episode. We look forward to you joining us again for the next one on Chapter 1, Around the World in 300 Pages. And from there, we will cruise right on through the rest of the book and hopefully get to talk to some of our case study writers, in addition to the author of our foreword, Brian Alexander. So stay on top of that subscribe button to make sure that you're getting all of the good stuff, and we will check in with you next time.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Steve. This was fun.
Thanks.
The Worldbuilding Workshop podcast is a production of Trent Hergenreiter and Stephen Slota. Our theme song, Stompin' at Midnight, is a copyright-free Creative Commons production created by composer Kevin MacLeod. The show is mixed and edited by Stephen Slota. The companion text, The Worldbuilding Workshop, Teaching Critical Thinking and Empathy Through World Modeling, Simulation, and Play, is published by the MIT Press, copyright 2025. Print copies can be purchased through the MIT Press website. The audiobook version, narrated by Stephen Slota, is available at www.theworldbuildingworkshop.com.